Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to cover my round 4 game from the October Marshall premiere. Now, if you followed the round 3 video, you know that I drew a very interesting game against International Master David Brodsky, in which we played a very, very interesting Caro-Kann, in which I was probably worse for most of the game, but managed to hold a draw in the end. In this one, I had the white piece again and was hoping to kind of, still, keep the good chess going. I was on 2.5 out of 3 going into this game and, still in contention in this 5-round weekender event. My opponent in this one was Grandmaster Sergey Kudrin, who's a name that has been quite well known in chess for several decades. He's originally from the Soviet Union, but after moving from the Soviet Union, immigrating here, I believe in the late 80s, early 90s, he's been a fixture on the American chess scene, mainly coaching these days, I believe, but known to play an open or a weekend tournament from time to time. In his heyday, he was someone that played in the U.S. Championship a few times and really was also playing in some Fide World Cups. So definitely a very, very good player and a good challenge for me. So without further ado, let's get into it. So I went with knight f3. Part of the reason I did this is because I actually knew that Sergey was a religious Grunfeld player. And one of the things that, I sometimes do when I'm trying to play Grunfeld players, I try to target them in specific opening lines. So knight f3 was a specific move order that I wanted to play against a Grunfeld line. And, I'm not going to get into exactly what I was planning because I might actually utilize it at some other juncture. But I suppose you can try and think upon why not playing d4 right away, what differences there are with knight f3. I will say this, my second move was going to be c4, and that's much I'll say with extent to what I was planning as far as Grunfeld or anti-Grunfeld ideas. In any case, after knight f3, Sergey actually played c5, and this actually kind of threw off my plans entirely because I didn't really have much of an interest in playing a symmetrical English with c4. These structures are completely playable, but I do believe that black tends to be okay in these types of setups. And so I had the intention of playing kind of a knight f3 c4 setup, but not against the symmetrical. So I opted to go in a different direction with the move e3. And e3 is a very, very modest move, but I thought that it had the practical possibility of potentially having Sergey spend a lot of time in the opening because this is such an unusual way to play. And it's actually something that I've employed before. You might recall a game I played against International Master Brandon Jacobson from earlier this year where I actually played like a Queen's Gambit declined reverse type of setup. And I was essentially intending to get something on the board like that because it's something that I already knew. I could play the first few moves relatively quickly, and Sergey would probably be thinking from from move to move because it's not something he's necessarily familiar with. And in fact, that's kind of what happened because after e3, g6 was played, and he spent a lot of time just to play g6. And then after d4, bishop g7, I played bishop e2, and then he spent another 5+ minutes trying to think about what direction he wanted to go in. Essentially, the dilemma for him, or I think the question he was asking himself, is what line do I want to kind of get a position in? Because he's, again, a Grunfeld player with black and a Sicilian Grunfeld player against d4 and Sicilian Dragon player actually against e4 for the most part. He's a Sicilian player. And with white, I believe he's an e4 player. But if you actually look at this position right now with his kingside fianchetto and c5, this actually looks like a Catalan type of opening, or like a English, with the offering d takes c5. And, him not being a Catalan player, I could see why, having this type of position would actually give him cause to pause, and you want to get to a structure he's more familiar with. And that's the other thing you can kind of do with move order trickeration and not playing the most forcing lines, is you give your opponent the opportunity to kind of waste a lot of time trying to figure out which setup makes more sense. So after bishop e2, he actually wound up playing knight f6 finally. That is the most natural move. And then after castles, he spent more time because I'm actually kind of threatening to take the pawn on c5 if I want. Note that there's no like check picking it up right away. He actually decided to play c takes d4. And already here I thought, you know what? This is a small victory. White is not better in any way, but I at least got him to resolve the tension, which is I'm kind of cool with. And we basically are now transposing into a Carlsbad structure, which I have a lot of familiarity with. So after c takes d4, e takes d4, and d5, what do I mean by the Carlsbad structure? Well, white has this queenside pawn majority, and black actually has a kingside pawn majority. And this is the type of structure that comes a lot out of d4 openings. The problem for Sergey is that he's actually not a d4 player. So his familiarity or lack thereof in this structure, I think, would potentially hurt him. The other thing here is that I have a great deal of familiarity in the Carlsbad. If you've seen any of my games in the Queen's Gambit declined with black, whether it's the d5, e6, a6 line, whether it's the exchange variation of the Queen's Gambit, whether it's the Moisenko game, I have played the structure quite a bit, and I do kind of understand the plans pretty well. And here, white is basically playing the black side of that structure a tempo up. So I felt pretty confident that even though the position is probably equal, I did think I had the better time of it just because from an experience standpoint, even though this is a Grandmaster that's been playing chess for longer than I've been alive. So now one difference, though, is the fact that black has fianchettoed, and so typically in the Carlsbad, again, black here is basically assuming the role of the white side because he has the kingside pawn majority. Typically, this bishop on g7 is on d6, and that actually has some differences because here the bishop on g7 is kind of biting on granite, so to speak, because as soon as I play c3, it's kind of blocked out. And so I thought that factor would help me as well. But anyways, let's see how the game goes, and you can be the judge. So after d5, I went c3, which is standard here. Not going for a move like c4 because that would just give me an Islani, but instead modestly just kind of blocking out the bishop on this diagonal. Black now played knight c6, which is also normal. And now I played bishop f4. And this is actually one of the merits of playing in this particular way, this Carlsbad position rather than typical Carlsbad positions. Because normally if the bishop gets onto this diagonal where it's controlling the e5 square, or conversely normally it's the e4 square, white's or black has actually just equalized. And so here, I thought that the bishop on f4 is a really good place. It stops the queen from actually getting on this diagonal, and it's all because this bishop on g7 is actually not on d6 where it normally is. After bishop f4, black castled, and I played h3. And my idea here was now to just ensure my bishop stays on this diagonal because sometimes there's knight h5 ideas challenging that bishop. It turns out I could also play knight bd2 anyway, and then the point is that after knight h5, I could go bishop e3. But I didn't love concepts of the knight potentially getting to f4 with tempo against my bishop on e2. Apparently, I could play black could play queen c7, and I could go rook e1 and pop back to f1. And the knight, if it gets to f4, is only going to be a temporary inconvenience. So, knight f6 back would be typical. And then here, I probably have to wind up playing h3 anyway to stop knight g4. But the point is, I thought if I can keep my bishop on the diagonal, why not? So that's why I played h3. So anyways, after h3, black played b6, and this is a move I really don't like. The reason for it is that I'm not sure it advances, black's cause in any particular way. Now, you might say, oh, this bishop is trying to get to b7, but on b7, it's actually just behind the d5 pawn and is not particularly active. So, yeah, I don't really agree with that. Instead, I'd say bishop f5 is a bit more precise. You get it to a really active diagonal, long diagonal, and you also fight for central squares, in particular e4. And then also in the future, black may want to consider some type of minority attack, but of course b6 does not advance that cause at all. So it is what it is. After b6, I played knight bd2. Which is, again, just normal developing move here. And now bishop e7 was played. And now I went rook e1. And this is kind of another plan in the Carlsbad is, once you get your pieces out, you want to fight for these two squares, e4 and e5, the squares on the e-file, because typically you actually don't make use of your queenside pawn majority in the opening and early middle game. That's actually the reason why for a long time it actually was thought to be easier to play the other side of the structure and not the side that I'm playing, because if you try to actually take advantage of your pawn majority with c4, d4 actually becomes very weak, and sometimes it becomes an isolated pawn, sometimes it becomes a target, and at the very least you're actually creating an extra pawn island by going for that pawn break. Whereas black, on the other hand, can sometimes prepare to break in the center and try to prepare e5 break. That's known as the Carlsbad. That's known as the Botvinnik plan with f6 and e5. But because the nature of the fianchetto here, that's less likely. But the other thing black can try to do is play for a minority attack on the queen side, playing for b5, b4, undermining white's queenside pawn majority. So the point is that typically white tries to play, or the side that's playing, the side with the queenside pawn majority in these Carlsbad structures tends to actually, basically tends to play with his pieces, not as pawns, because pushing the pawns in the center actually creates weaknesses. So that's kind of the point there. So anyways, after rook e1, Sergey actually was attuned to the fact that I was probably going to go bishop f1, maybe even bishop f3, and then control the e4 square forever. And so interestingly enough here, Sergey decided to play knight e4. And this is a very, very interesting move because on the face of it, it seems like he's just giving himself really bad double pawns. But in fact, taking e4 would be a very bad idea. And it kind of works tactically for black. The reason is after knight takes e4, d takes e4, wherever I move the knight, I actually am losing control over the e5 square. So if I go like knight d2, now e5 actually is a very, very good break that opens up this bishop, by the way, on this diagonal with d takes e4, and this one as well after the e5 pawn gets traded. And after something like d takes e5 and knight takes e5, black is actually for choice because this knight can hop into d3. These bishops are both playing, and, black is quite active. So really, taking on e4 I thought was not really such a great idea. And I also wasn't enthusiastic about knight e5 because after something like knight takes e5, bishop takes, and d takes, I thought queen c7, and now the e5 pawn I thought is a little bit vulnerable, and a little bit more vulnerable than the e4 pawn. And so even though we both have some weird pawns in the e-file, black gets to play rook d8, hit my queen on d1. It's hard to defend this one. So I thought that taking on e4 is probably a bad idea. And at least now he's justifying the position of the bishop on b7, which really did not make a lot of sense to me. After knight e4, I played the move bishop f1. And my idea was now, again, to just challenge this knight on e4, and now I'm actually threatening to take it because I can just win a pawn with rook takes e4. So now black actually has to justify the position of the knight on e4, and he did so by playing the move f5. Note that if you play a move like knight takes d2, after queen takes d2, I have really excellent control of the e5 square, and this square is actually the highway through which my pieces could be activated, and I can develop an initiative on the king side quite quickly with h4, h5, try to loosen some squares on the king side as well. Some positions my bishop will come to d3 and I this diagonal. And again, the bishop on b7 is actually not a good piece right now. So it makes sense that black tried to justify the knight with f5. Now this is probably the first critical position of the game because, it's quite clear that, black's essentially taking a serious stake in the center right now and really, playing a very aggressive move, this f5 move, because it introduces some other ideas I have to be kind of aware of. One of them is actually g5. So if I do nothing, let's say for the sake of argument, I just shuffle the rook on the queen side. Let's say I go rook b1. Not a good move, just giving you an example. Now e6, rook a1, and g5 would actually be very, very dangerous, because all of a sudden this black queen could transfer very quickly over to the king side, and in many positions this h3 move that I played to ensure my bishop stays on this long diagonal actually would create a hook for black's pieces. So g4 is really a lever that can really pry open the g file quite uncomfortably, and it's not atypical to see a rook crashing down the f file very quickly, black having really good counterplay in the dark squares based upon this monster knight on e4. So I have to really be careful and just aware that the position is actually quite sharp and double-edged here. I actually decided to play the move bishop b5, in part because I thought that now that f5 was played, the e5 square was sensitive, and I didn't want to put a piece on e5 right away, because I thought by occupying the square right away, black could actually take multiple times, and the square wouldn't actually be a weakness because I'd be occupying it with the d-pawn. So to illustrate what that looks like, one thing I did consider was knight e5, but I didn't love the positions after knight takes e5, bishop takes, d takes, and knight d2, queen d2, and e6, because I thought that even though white has probably a slightly better position just based upon the dark square control, I thought that black is actually not in as terrible shape as it looks, because now that the square is actually occupied by a pawn, the square is not actually a weakness that black has to worry about. And so I thought that black maybe could have some play on the c file with rook c8, maybe get to some scenario where the queens are traded. And even though white is better for sure, I actually discounted that white would have serious winning chances here. Although maybe that's actually not the case, because looking at it now, you could see that there are light pawns and light squares everywhere, and maybe I could entertain some h4, h5 thrust in the future. I just was skeptical about it, and I thought that I might have better, so I decided to go in a different direction. But that was certainly a line that I did look at. I just thought that by playing bishop b5, I'm actually trying to control the square with my pieces still, because I thought bishop takes c6 and putting a knight on e5 was a good idea. Another thing to point out, because there were a lot of other options in this position, one move that the computer really found quite attractive was actually h4. And this is a move that kind of ran afoul of covering the g4 square, because I thought that, I thought it was important that I didn't just leave the square permanently weak. I thought maybe another knight could dance in to that square. But it turns out that this move actually does a more important job by controlling the g5 square and ensures that the g5 break is not something I have to worry about. So now if black goes for e6, I can just go g3 and kind of play around the knight on e4. Now, I think the reason this is kind of difficult to play, or, and something that I ultimately didn't go for, is because I wasn't convinced it actually stopped g5 forever. There were some circumstances I believed where h6 and g5 could be a possibility. And if that happened, the move g3 would really not have helped my cause, because it would have created another lever for black to potentially rip open more files after h takes g5. So I wasn't really convinced that h4 was the right treatment, because here I'm still going to have a hard time getting rid of this knight. I'm not sure if the idea is to eventually play f3, but then that weakens my whole pawn chain. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to just play around it. Maybe I'm supposed to put a knight on g5. It wasn't totally clear to me how white should proceed here, and so I wasn't buying it. So yeah, I played bishop b5. So after bishop b5, black played e6, which is the natural move, just to, again, reinforce this structure. And now g5 is actually somewhat of a legitimate threat. So in this position, I decided to play bishop takes c6 and follow through with my plan. Although it should be noted that h4 again is actually very playable, and the computer really, really likes this option. But anyways, after bishop takes c6, I went for knight e5. And this was essentially the concept. Give up my bishop pair, but in return occupy the e5 square with pieces, and in some lines actually kick this knight away with f3. And I thought that, white would pretty much be okay here. After knight e5, I actually expected bishop b7, And my idea here was to go knight d3, because actually when the bishop retreats, g5 is still a threat. I actually just move my knight away from the square, so all of a sudden I can't even defend it again, so I have to really be worried about g5. But my thought process was, if I get the dark squared bishops off the board and retain the option of playing f3, I'm in really good shape. So after knight d3, I thought bishop at e5 is a threat, and yeah, the computer actually recommends bishop a6, but if g5, now I have bishop e5, and these exchanges followed by f3, I thought would be really good for white. Now, it turns out that, again, this move bishop a6 is good, and I would have to go knight b4 to challenge the bishop, and then this bishop could go back. And actually, we could see a repetition based upon the fact that if I don't put my knight back on d3, I wind up having to recapture on e5 with a pawn again. And again, that makes the square not so much of a weakness if my pawn's occupying it. So a repetition could have happened like this, like bishop a6, knight d3, bishop knight b4, bishop b7. So, but that would assume that black actually retreated the bishop to b7, which surprisingly he did not. Instead, he actually decided to play the move bishop takes e5. And here my spidey senses, so to speak, were kind of tingling, because it seemed to me a very puzzling decision to get rid of your good bishop, so to speak, for this bishop on c6 that's behind this wall of pawns. So I was trying to figure out what was the justification for giving up this bishop right away. Yeah, I really couldn't figure it out until Sergey played his next move. So I played bishop takes e5, obviously, trying to just recapture with the bishop. And here I thought, okay, my next move is f3, and then I have a great position because, let's say black plays a move like bishop b7, just for instance. Now after f3, if knight d2, queen d2, even though they're opposite colored bishops on the board, white is so much better than black here because this bishop reigns supreme on the dark squares. There are dark square weaknesses all over on the king side, and the presence of this backward pawn on the e-file allows me to get really, really good pressure. And so this is the type of position I actually would think is very close to winning, even though the material is equal, because my bishop has no opponent. In many opposite colored bishops positions, it comes down to which side is actually more active, more attacking, the one with the initiative. So. And this is the type of thing I thought I was going to really be in the driver's seat for. So instead of this type of sequence, instead of bishop b7, of course, black actually went for the move queen h4. And here essentially was black's idea to try and get pressure on f2 really quickly before I can conveniently just consolidate my position. So I was thinking for some time here because I was trying to figure out what I should do, what's the best course of action. The most natural move I thought was not such a good idea. It turns out it's playable, but I thought it's not such a good idea, and that's actually queen e2. Queen e2, I would just defend the pawn on f2, and it seems to not be a problem. But actually, the move bishop b5 would be a little bit annoying because now my queen is potentially dragged away from that square, and then essentially queen takes f2 and takes on d2 could happen. And so in this position, white could actually play knight f3, and this is a move that I looked at because basically if I play queen takes b5, queen takes f2 check, king h1, and queen takes d2, black has won a pawn, and I don't think I have enough of an attack here to justify this, and it turns out I was right. I mean, I can go queen d7, after rook f7, queen takes e6, queen b2, queen d5, and rook af8. Black is active enough that this shouldn't be a huge problem, even though white is also quite active. Black also has a very reasonable position because this 94 is quite decent, even if the black rooks are passive. So it's just not something I wanted to go for if I didn't see anything super forcing that was good for white. So I didn't really want to allow this bishop b5 stuff, but it turns out there was this move knight f3 here, and I saw this as well, and the point is that after bishop e2, knight h4, and bishop c4, I'm actually still slightly better here because the features in the position as far as pawn structure is concerned has not changed. Black still has a bunch of dark square weaknesses based upon the formation of his pawns on light squares, and the e-pawn is backward. But I thought that I could probably get more out of the position than this, and so I didn't want to go for this type of game. Although there's nothing wrong with this setup. And note that the move bishop h2 is a nice finesse, trying to get the knight on that outpost, because the key thing in this position is actually playing f3 to evict the knight on e4. As soon as the knight on e4 is forced to leave that post, white takes a little bit more control of the game, because the knight on e5 actually can't be evicted by black's pawns. So something to think about, but I basically didn't go for this line because I thought I had a little bit better. The other line I was thinking about, and actually turns out to be the best, is actually bishop g3. And it's remarkable because I found the first move in this position, and I even found the second move, but I actually evaluated it incorrectly. Now, the idea with bishop g3 is actually quite clever, because the knight on and the queen on h4 are both hitting that bishop, so it would seem that you might be losing a pawn. While the concept is that if you play knight takes g3, it's actually not a good move, because white actually plays the intermediate move, knight f3. And the point is that now this queen is hit on h4, black's going to lose the knight on g3 on the next turn, and this rook on e1 is now eyeing e6. So if you go for queen f4, still trying to actually secure a pawn for your troubles, I go fg3, queen takes g3, and rook takes e6. And this position I believe to be strategically winning for white, because the dark squares are so sensitive, and this knight is going to come into one of them. Not to mention the fact that the bishop is hanging right now, and white might also control the e-file. And that doesn't even mention that the d5 pawn is also going to be a target, because it's isolated and weak. So those factors actually give black real problems on the dark squares, and white has basically excellent dark square control. I saw this idea, and I rejected bishop g3 because of the move queen h6. And so I thought that queen h6 was quite decent because it challenges the knight on d2, and I thought that black would follow up with g5 and f4, and I thought that my bishop on g3 would kind of be shut out of the game. But it actually turns out that after knight f3, f4, bishop h2, g5, and knight e5, white is actually massively better. And the reason for that is white is still going to get an f3. And sure, the bishop on h2 is dormant for now, but later on it could maneuver itself, reposition itself with king h1 and bishop g1 and bishop f2, and it can kind of get out the doghouse. And in the meantime, white just has a massive initiative, both on the queen side with the queen side pawns, but also based upon the control of the e-file and the knight on this outpost on e5. And so after bishop e8 here, f3, knight f6, and a4, it's actually white that is significantly better, because even though this bishop on h2 is not quite playing in the game, it doesn't really tell the whole story of the position. And yeah, this is something that I think happens a lot for me, where I actually see the first few moves of a line, but I reject it because of some particular reason, some misjudgment, and I miss out on an opportunity that would be quite decent. And so that's something I definitely need to work on. Anyways, instead of these options, queen e2 and knight d2, or knight f3, instead of queen e2 or bishop g3, I went for the next logical thing covering the f2 pawn, which is knight takes e4. And this is a decision I didn't take too lightly, because it was clear to me how black would recapture. If you play f takes e4, I can just pop this bishop back to g3, or even just go queen d2, and this is a two results game in my opinion, because this bishop on c6 is still cut out on this diagonal, and sure, it can come to b5 and potentially try to take control of the f1 square, but it's still not going to be as good as my bishop that's actually eyeing the king. And so I pretty much figured that after knight takes e4, d takes e4 is going to be played, and all of a sudden it's actually kind of double-edged, because this bishop that was kind of dormant now actually has counterplay on the long diagonal, and I have to be very, very alert not to ensure that it, just gets even more powerful, because both of our bishops are eyeing the kings. the black queen is more in the neighborhood of my king than I am in the neighborhood of its own king. So again, this is something that I did not take lightly, but I just thought it was actually the best chance to play for a win. After d takes e4, I actually played another mistake, and I think this is kind of where my problems began, because I was not wrong to evaluate this position as being better for white. White has a slightly better pawn structure, right, based upon I have no double pawns, my structure is pretty compact, and my bishop is still more active than the one on c6, because this bishop is still right in the neighborhood of that black king. But I have to be really precise about how I handle this position, and I played the move queen b3, which really just drags the queen away from the king side. Now, I had a very specific plan in mind, and the plan was to play c4 and d5. And my thought process was that if I'm able to open this diagonal for the king on with the king on g8, given the fact that I have this other diagonal with my bishop on e5, I figured the position would just be winning. And so I thought trying to force through that diagonal at any point would just be the way to go. But it actually turns out that it's the wrong way to do it. Simply because my queen is too far away from my king in many lines. Instead, the move c4 would actually have been way stronger. And the reason for that is not because I'm going to try and play d5 right away, but because I'm going to try and actually make use of my pawn majority on the queen side now. And so if rook a d8, I actually could play the move b4, and all of a sudden my pawns on the queen side actually have real say in the position. And I'm actually threatening b5, a4, a5, a takes b6, and in many positions just getting a rook to the 7th rank. Now, you might think this takes forever, but the problem is that as long as my queen is on d1, black actually does not have an effective pawn break to open up the position. Because if you play e3, well, I'm just winning a pawn. And more crucially, if you play f4, I actually always have the move queen g4 with my queen on d1. And the problem here is that my queen attacks f4, attacks h4, and it attacks e6. And so you're really kind of obliged to trade queens. But with the queens off the board, this bishop becomes more of a factor than the one on c6 because it's so effectively anchored by another pawn, and black's bishop isn't. And again, my majority on the queen side actually becomes a serious factor. And so keeping the queen on d1 was actually the key to not kind of allowing black this counterplay that actually wound up happening in the game. Anyways, after queen b3, rook a e8 was played. And yeah, this defends the e6 pawn effectively. The move that I thought could be played but was not so good was actually bishop d5. And this is kind of what I was kind of hoping for, was that now I can play c4, the bishop retreats, and then I play d5, and I'm slowly prying open this diagonal while shutting the bishop out of my king side. But rook a8 is much better. And after rook a8, I actually followed through with my plan, which was the move c4. Ironically, or maybe not ironically, but interestingly enough, the best move in this position is actually queen d1, actually going back, scrapping my plan, and making sure that f4 can be kind of managed effectively because of this queen g4 move. But of course, I didn't understand that my plan was not really working, and so I, of course, went forward with it. But I think that's kind of funny that it just goes to show you just how critically important it was, how crucial it was to have my queen on d1. But anyways, after rook a8, I did go c4, and now black went for f4. And I'm actually in some serious trouble here because black actually has very legitimate threats against my king side now, and I don't have a lot of pieces in the neighborhood of my king. Really, my queen is a little bit far away right now to deal with some threats, and my rook on e1 is really the only piece like in the immediate periphery of the king, kind of trying to defend some things. You might also say my bishop on e5 as well. But you can see this bishop is bearing down on my king. This rook now is going to be active, and the queen is also active, and so I have to be very, very careful. And here, I played the move d5, which actually loses on the spot. Now, the reason it loses is because of a tactics. And again, this is something I need to work on, improve on. And the move is just e3. And this is essentially the problem with the whole setup, is that after e3, black's actually hitting me first where it matters, which is on the king side, whereas I'm not quite getting the threats against black's king just yet. So black's actually just a little bit faster, and it makes all the difference. Now, if e takes d5 was played, this is the thing that I was actually calculating and angling for. I thought that after c takes d5, I have an advantage because now I'm threatening discovery checks, and the king wouldn't have anywhere to go on any of these diagonals. So the bishop would have to be sacrificed on c6, but after rook takes e5, d takes e6, check, and king g7, I thought that my c pawn would be the most dangerous pawn in the game on the board, being the most advanced. And I thought that after queen c3, I'd be pinning the rook, queen f6, and rook ac1, and I actually just stopped my calculations in a position like this in my head over the board, because I thought, all right, this c-pawn is a really dangerous pawn. I'm just trying to push it. I have my rook behind the pawn as well on c1, and this should be a great winning chances for white. But e3 just turns that all on its head, because after e3, e takes f2, check is threatened, and I have to deal with it. So I played f takes e3 because I thought that after f3, this is just a protected pass pawn, and that would spell serious disaster. Queen f2 check at the right moment would be nice. E takes d5 is also just playable now. Yeah, it's just not a good position with the pawn being protected passer with black to move. So I played f takes e3, but I knew full well here that I was losing, because I'd actually seen now that black could play the move f3. And it's a very, very thematic breakthrough. You basically sack a pawn to actually earn access to a square and really just rip open white's king side. And the issue here is that after f takes e3, my queen is actually blocked off from important squares on the king side. And so you could just get that sense about how it's kind of dangerous when your queen is far away from the king. Attacks tend to be more potent. And so now f2 check is a serious threat. But of course, if I take again, this position is just lost because the rook comes into the game with decisive effect. And all of a sudden there's queen g5 check, there's rook takes h3, there's just all types of nasty, nasty mating ideas. So, and I should also say that there's also queen f2 check and rook takes h3 mate, which is probably the most potent of them all. So anyways, after f3, I tried to defend the best I could, knowing full well this position was totally lost. And my only hope at this juncture was basically the time situation. I'd actually had about 40 minutes on my clock, and black had about 15 to 20 minutes on the clock. So I was thinking that if I defended tenaciously, maybe I'd get a last-ditch chance. But my position, I knew, was beyond repair. So after f3, I played the move rook f1, which I thought was the best shot at trying to keep the game going. Another alternative besides g takes f3 was king h2. But I was reluctant to go for this one because of queen g5, which attacks the bishop on e5, but also threatens mate on g2. And I just thought this was too much. I could play bishop g3, which temporarily holds everything together. But now e takes d5 could be played, and black isn't even down a pawn, and all of a sudden I have weaknesses everywhere. Of course, my king is weak. This f-pawn is very dangerous. Black's bishop is now going to be ripped open very soon. And yeah, it seemed to me that there's no counterplay for white here, and if I went to a purely defensive crouch, I thought that I would just be rolled over slowly, so I tried to play for tricks as well. So instead, I went rook f1, which at least I thought prevented f2 check. I thought that if f2, now my king can go to h2, and I thought the f-pawn was kind of under control, and I'd have some coverage on the dark squares again. So I thought this was not very good for black. But, of course, black played the right move here, which is f takes g2. Just keeping everything kind of open. And, yeah, it's actually very difficult to cope here, because taking on g2 allows queen g5 check, again, exposing my king and forcing my bishop into this really bad square here and giving black access to the d5 pawn. Now, it actually turns out instead of f takes g2, an even better way to win the game would have actually been e takes d5. But I think this is not so easy to see. The point is that after c takes d5, you actually go bishop a4. And the point is that the queen is actually forced off of this diagonal from which they're discovered checks, because the queen is defending c4, but also defending the bishop on a4. And so the queen has to move, let's say queen c3, and now f takes g2 is played, and there's just no pressure against the black king, which makes all the difference in the world. I could go king takes g2, but now after queen e4 check, black actually just picks up the bishop without even losing his own bishop, because now this square also becomes available. And so e takes d5 was actually the most precise, but not so easy to see. After f takes g2, I went for really the only move in the position that I thought kept the game going. I tried to make other things work, but they just weren't. One thing, for instance, is rook takes f8. I thought, okay, if I trade the rooks and use the g-pawn as a shield, maybe I could hold on. But the issue is that after rook f8, and d takes c6, black just has queen takes h3 is an option, but even better is queen f2 check. And after king h2, g1 queen equals mate is just another kind of example of how this position could go south just like that. And just my queen is so far away from the action that, just over immediately. And so actually exchanging the rooks doesn't actually help my cause, because another rook shows up and I actually lose control of f2. So really the only way I can keep this position going is by trying to plug the f-file in some way. And I decided to do that by playing the move rook f4, which the computer actually points out is really the best move in the position just to keep the game going. Although it's giving like a -4, -5 advantage to black because it's completely winning. After rook f4, the game does go on though, and black does have to make a few decent moves. So just trying to keep the game going for a little bit longer. After rook f4, black played queen takes h3, which is a very good decision. If you play rook takes f4 right away, I go e takes f4, and all of a sudden things aren't so clear because my queen is now finally controlling the h3 pawn, so the queen can't just dive in there. And I will use the g-pawn as a shield, and my bishop on e5 is actually doing a great job of blocking the e-file, but also it's going to shut down the f-file for the black rook as well. And so white's actually kind of okay here because this rook is not getting in, the bishop doesn't seem to be getting in, and there are no checks. So after rook f4, black did play queen takes h3, and now the threat is actually queen h1 check, and the issue is I really don't have a good way of stopping it. So I thought, you know what, my best chance in this position was actually going to be to give up the exchange and to kind of just play that position because there's no way I could stop queen h1 check. So I went for d takes c6. And here, actually, black had a really good opportunity to kind of like shut the game down in some ways. So black played queen h1, but another move that was possible was g5. And this actually, the point here is that actually rook f6, rook d8 is actually, I think, winning. The point is that after queen c2, queen h1 check now, king f2, rook takes f6, bishop takes f6, and queen takes a1. The difference here is that this rook actually gets active on the back rank before I'm actually able to get active myself. And there's some rook g1 check threat ideas. There's also the queen getting in via e4 at times. And I think this was another way that black could have played the position. But queen h1 check was fine. So anyways, after queen h1, king f2, I gotta back up a second. Instead of g5, black played queen h1 check right away, and now I played king f2, and after queen takes a1, I played king takes g2, and all of a sudden the position is actually kind of a mess. And the reason it's a mess is because this rook on e8 is not yet in the game, and it needs to kind of get in the game to kind of deliver the final blow to the king on g2. But black does have to contend with the c-pawn kind of being a really decent source of counterplay. And so for the moment, it seems like I'm kind of walling off black's rooks from entering toward the white king, and that actually gives me some chances. The other thing here is temporarily the queen on a1 needs a move to actually get into the game and actually create a checking threat. And so it's not the easiest position in the world to convert. Here, it actually turns out that the best move in the position is actually the move that Sergey did not play, and this gave me a real chance because Sergey played the move g5, which is actually just a blunder, amazingly. And it's amazing that g5 before playing queen h1 check is better than g5 now, and we'll see why in a moment. But black should have played the move queen b1. And the point here with queen b1 is that now, in many lines, queen e4 check becomes an idea. So if I go c7 now, black can play g5 now, challenging the rook on f4. And after rook takes f4, there's a threat of queen f1 check and queen e4 check, and those are too difficult to stop. And so the position is actually just lost because I can't defend both of those threats. Now, another point is that if let's say I don't go c7, let's say I go bishop d6, now black can actually take on f4, and after e takes f4, go queen e4 check, and here actually pick up the c6 pawn. And so that's the other problem, is that if I keep the pawn on c6, it becomes a target, and this type of position, after queen f3, I can try to get the queens off the board, but even here the position is losing in the long run because we both have 5 pawns, but black's also up in exchange. So the easiest way would actually be to get the king to d7 and just give up the exchange, because you actually just have a winning king pawn endgame having 5 pawns versus 4. But yeah, thankfully for me, g5 check was played right away, and it actually changes the position drastically. And the reason for that is because now I can play the move queen d3, and this remarkably makes the position just equal. White is actually no longer worse, and the reason is that taking the rook on f4 is actually just a losing move. If you play g takes f4, I can play queen d7, and now all of a sudden I'm the one threatening mate on g7, and black does not actually have any effective checks. The bishop is controlling the pawn on b2, and the queen can't deliver a check otherwise. And yeah, you can go f3 check, but I can just go king f2, and there's still no more effective checks, and you can't actually stop mate on g7. If you play rook f7, I push by queen takes c8 check, and then I take again with check, and I actually just eventually just checkmate. And so, amazingly, this rook sacrifice cannot be accepted. And the other great thing about queen d3, and another reason why it should not have been allowed, and this g5 move is a mistake, is because it actually centralizes the queen to such an extent that the queen on a1 can't get into the game. And so a lot of those lines before we were looking at, the queen on a1 was delivering checks via e4 or c2 on the light squares. But all of a sudden, the queen actually controls these light squares on the back rank, and coupled with the bishop on e5, they actually make for a really good team. And so if you actually look at the position right now, the black queen actually only has 2 other squares on the first rank to actually maneuver on, and both of them don't actually create a threat of a check. And so after queen d3, black actually played queen e1, and unfortunately, this move actually loses. A better try would have actually been rook takes f4, e takes f4, and now queen e1. And the point is that if I go queen d7 now, black has a perpetual check based upon the queen actually getting to e2 right away, and really based upon the fact that this this pawn that was on e3 is now on f4, so my king is not shielded from some checks. Instead, the game continuation changes everything, because after queen e1 now, there's still no checks being threatened at the moment, and after bishop c3, I actually can force the queen away, which is not the case in the previous line. Now again, let's just go back just to see that. So if you go rook f4 right away, e takes f4, and now queen e1, if I go for bishop c3 here, well, I don't believe this should work because of queen h4. And again, there's some checks here that are going to be a problem, and my king is not going to be able to escape all of these checks. But in this particular version, with queen e1 first, black's actually not threatening any checks. If black could move again, there are actually no checks in the position. And so I don't have to move my rook. I don't have to resolve any tension because there's nothing threatened yet. And so bishop c3 is a valuable tempo that forces the queen off of the first rank and away from these menacing squares on the king side. And now if you look at the position, remarkably, black only has 2 squares to even go to. a1, back where it came, or c1. Every other square is taken. All the squares on this diagonal are taken. These squares are taken. These squares are taken. It's just an unbelievable position where that just happens to be the case. And so now queen c1 was played, but now I actually can play rook takes f8 check, and after rook takes f8, I actually just went c7. And remarkably, even here, there are no checks. The queen is actually defending the f1 square. This queen on c1 actually has no squares to go to except a1. So the queen, remarkably, is actually nearly trapped on c1. And in the meantime, I'm actually able to push my own pawn and create a distraction. And unfortunately for black, the position is completely lost, because there's no way that the black rook can enter the game without giving up c8 queen. Just an amazing turn of events. Black played g4, trying to, at least, press onward with g3 and rook f2 check. But unfortunately, I'm just faster. And the move that wins here is now, remarkably, c8 queen. The point is that now rook takes c8 was played, and the rook is now, a decoy, or the rook is forced away because of the decoy that was the c pawn, and I gave up that pawn because of queen d7. And all of a sudden, there's queen takes c8 is a threat, but also queen g7 mate is a threat, and you actually can't stop both. And unfortunately for black, there's only one meaningful check that that black could give before my king is safe. And so I don't have to worry about queen f1 mate anymore because the rook is not on the file. And after queen c2 check, king g3, there are actually no more meaningful checks. So the position is just lost. Sergey played queen g6, just bringing the queen back towards the king and defending the mate. But now I just pick up the rook and I'm a piece up. And I thought he was going to resign here, but I could understand why the shock of what had just happened resulted in him playing a few more moves. He played king f7, and basically I just now windmilled with my queen to actually pick up some queenside pawns. There's no need to rush here. Black remarkably still doesn't have any checks. And after queen takes a7, king e8, queen b8 check, king d7, queen b7 check, king e8, queen c8 check. Note that I'm like windmilling in a way, or not windmilling, what's it called? I'm kind of doing like the ladder. I'm kind of like going back and forth up the stairs to get my king closer, or my queen closer to the black king. I took a pawn a7 just because I could, and then I finally played bishop b4. And here, Kudrin actually resigned because queen f8 check is really going to be a decisive threat. It's a mate threat right now, but once the queen moves, I'm probably going to wind up trading the queens or just picking up more pawns with check. And so there's no point in playing this position just a piece down. And so, yeah, all of a sudden, a position that I was supposed to lose, I actually wound up winning. And I got to 3.5 out of 4. what can I say? I think the opening actually did go pretty well for me. I had a large time advantage, but I really misjudged the attacking chances of black in the middle game, and I gave up a little bit too much counterplay in an attempt to convert my position. That was definitely a bad choice, but I didn't give up entirely, and even when I knew the position was lost, I tried to defend tenaciously because of the time situation. And fortunately for me, Sergey was not able to put me away in the most effective way. And then I took my chance when it came. So, some games aren't, clean. Some games aren't pretty, but you'll take the W. Anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.